Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Full Potential Show. I'm James Rick, and this is your number one non-boring source for personal development. And today on the line, we have Glen Hiemstra, founder of Futurist.com, professional speaker, writer, and consultant. He's the author of Turning the Future into Revenue. And our theme for today's show is what businesses and individuals need to know to shape their future. He's talked about these things in Business Week, Forbes, Bloomberg TV, USA Today, all over the web and offline media. And today we're going to talk about how this really can impact you, what's happening, interpreting the patterns of what's happening now so that you can predict the future. Glen, glad to have you on the show.
Thank you, James. Nice to be with you.
Nice to have you. And first of all, did you just come out of the womb predicting patterns, or is this a developed skill?
It is a developed skill, though it probably comes partly from personality style. If you do background tests like the Myers-Briggs, for example, it will tell you that I'm a person who's oriented to the future. So I grew up being interested, for example, in the space program and all of that kind of thing. So clearly I have a sort of personal interest in future things.
So there's some kind of genetic hardwiring that orients our time perspective. I mean, and then that kind of sets you up for developing the skill.
I think that's actually largely true. Is that you are kind of pre-wired to be more interested in the future, more interested in the past, more interested in the present. Though we all have this human capacity, is the way I describe it, to remember the past, anticipate the future, and if you do those two things to the maximum of your ability, you'll have a better or more rich kind of present. Most of us have our heads down all the time. We're too busy. We don't have time to worry about yesterday. We don't have time to worry about tomorrow. And therefore, we miss kinds of opportunities and learnings that we could get if we pay a little bit more attention to past and future.
And the evidence is all around us, right? I mean, the ability to at least know or have a general indication of where the future is going, it's all around us if we're looking for it.
It's the news is full of it every day, and part of my job, as I think of it, is to try to collect a lot of seemingly unconnected data, and then ask what are the patterns that we're seeing in that information. So, for example, a few years ago, I was beginning to anticipate what would happen if wealth disparity in the country got too big, and the evidence was really coming through that the middle class income in the United States, for example, was going flat, and it had actually been fairly flat since around 1980. And that can go on for a while, but it can't go on forever. And what we've begun to see, really starting in about 2008, in fact, I just wrote a blog today that said, I think the election of 2008 and the election of 2010 in the United States, even though different political parties won, were really people saying, hey, the economy's not working for me anymore in its current structure. And it's possible to see those things if you just pay attention to kind of the signals and then the patterns and then ask, what do they mean?
What do they mean? And for right now, I mean, folks that are sort of living that day to day because they feel like they have to. I mean, they're in this routine to survive. You know, it's a luxury, I think, to look into the future when you're not feeling like the wolves are at your door today. And so we've got to find that balance of, obviously, the best way to avoid wolves ever being at your door is to look into the future far enough to say, I'm going to move to a place where there's no wolves, or I'm going to do the things that won't lead to that ever happening again. But for right now, you're in a place of survival, let's say, and it's very difficult to look out into the future. But you need to set yourself up, like you said, to have a more rich present. What are some strategies from that position that can start moving you into more of this future orientation that's going to set you up?
Well, here's, I think, the very best strategy and the most simple strategy of all, and that's to ask, even though you might be at this point unemployed, you might be really struggling, to ask, what do I need to learn in the next 6 months that would better position me if an opportunity comes up? Here's my story about that. In the early 1990s, as the internet was beginning to transition to the World Wide Web, some people aren't old enough to remember when that happened, but there was the internet, and then there was the World Wide Web. And right about when that was happening, I was interviewed for a consulting job, which I did not get. I actually didn't win in the interview. But in the interview, I was asked two important questions. One of them was, what have you learned in the last 6 months? And I had to think of something. So I came up with an answer and said, this is what I learned in the last 6 months. And the follow-up question was the powerful one. It was, what do you plan to learn in the next 6 months? What would be your answer to that? Well, I had to come up with an answer in the interview. So I just blurted out, I've been studying this thing called the internet, but I've never really used it in my business. So in the next 6 months, I'm going to learn how to get on the internet and use it as part of my business. In that next 6 months came the announcement of Mosaic, the original web browser, the fact that the internet was going to become the World Wide Web, and that you should therefore register a homepage. I checked at the registry. Nobody had registered Futurist.com, even though there were lots and lots of very well-known futurists, better known than me at the time. So I registered Futurist.com and actually followed through on my threat to learn something in the next 6 months. I actually went to a class at a community college about how to use the internet and how to use computers more effectively. Long story. But the point is, the most important thing that I own, which is this website, Futurist.com, from which most of my business comes, I own because I answered the question, what is something that I'd like to learn that would be valuable for me to learn in the next 6 months? And then I actually did it.
And by that future orientation, you, like you said, you set yourself up for a rich future. Your future, a lot of it stems from the positioning from that critical time period. And we see that again and again in some very, very successful people. The timing was right. And a 6-month window is actually a very good, I think, block to focus on, because you look at the advent of the internet, you look at the computer technology. It's in that beginning phase of anything, that first 6 months, where you can really crack the nut and have something really big over the next few years if you're in a new emerging technology or something. And guess what? Any new technology requires that you learn something new, because there's nothing else out there that you know of that tells you how to use it.
Yes, and for example, right now I am putting most of my energy into trying to learn how to use. It's not big news in that it's not brand new. How to use social media more effectively in my speaking and consulting business. Because if I don't, I'm going to just be too far behind the curve.
All right, now how do you start to use this information that you're learning to, let's say, predict patterns or see where the future might be? Is there any tips that you have around that?
Well, number one, read things on a pretty continuous basis, both the sort of general media, and then identify some specialized media that you find interesting. They might be blogs, they might be magazine websites. For example, I like one called Technology Review that comes out of MIT University, which does a really nice job of sort of describing things that are coming to us in the somewhat longer term. And they'll say, well, here's a company with the new invention, and if this really works out, it's going to be a big deal 3 years from now. Well, if that captures your imagination, it's something to start learning about. It's too early to do anything with it, but just start paying attention to it. So that's the kind of thing that I do. And I have a somewhat random but pretty regular reading pattern and kind of collecting of data pattern that I do almost all on the web.
Okay, so this intentionally planning what you want to learn, but also having a routine around learning, that you're continuously learning, picking up what's happening, not only in the general news, but it may be in some specialized circles related to what you really want to focus on.
Yes, and so it might only be a half a dozen websites and blogs that you tune into on a regular basis. It might be every day, it might be every other day, but you're just trying to pay attention to what's coming. It's partly to tease your own imagination. If you're working in certain kinds of industries or companies and so on, it may give you some information advantage that you can use in your job. And otherwise, it might just be stretching your mind. Another thing that I do, by the way, is I actually encourage everybody to read at least one science fiction novel per year.
Oh.
Because nobody that I know, and I know a lot of science fiction writers personally, nobody that I know is better at doing the following. They say, here's what's going on today, and here's some of what appears to be likely to be going on in the future. What would the world really look like if that happened? And
I think that's brilliant advice. And what it seems to me is there's a lot of imagination involved. Once you've accumulated the information, you've kind of predicted, now it's time to stretch your imagination like you did in the example of what happens if this disparity keeps happening. What would happen if the rich were so rich and the poor were so poor? What would the effects of that be? And science fiction writers do that all the time in the sense of, what would happen if technology keeps evolving at the pace that it does? So now we take that knowledge and now we expand our imagination to think, what would that look like? What in that fantasy land, if everything kept on the track that it's on, what would that look like?
Yes, here's a great example. A writer, one of my favorite writers, is a guy named Bruce Sterling, and one of his lesser-known books is a book called Holy Fire, and in this book, it's 2098. The year 2098, and biotechnology has developed the means by which you can essentially live forever. So you get old, you're 50, 60, 70, you go in for a treatment, now you're restored to like a 30-year-old, and then you can keep going. Well, two things happen. Number one, old people never leave their jobs. So the second thing that happens is there's no room for 20-somethings because there's never any advancement possible. So the story is kind of all about this sort of band of 20-somethings who sort of roam the world in 2098 because there just isn't any place for them in the normal economy because all these old people are working forever. Well, now, if you read that, you think, well, now, maybe if I'm of a scientific bent, I'd like to get into this field of helping extend our lifespan. And there's lots and lots of work going on in biology and technology and a variety of startup companies and mainline healthcare companies and so on helping everybody to live much longer. Or maybe you would say, well, I think that'd really be a bad idea. I'd rather get into social policy and go to work for some social agency that's trying to say maybe we shouldn't all live so long. So you get different ideas of things to do as a result of asking, hey, what would happen if everybody lived really a long time?
So that's fun. I think that's a great point to land on is think about what would happen if, think about that and look at the science fiction books and stuff that are that are entertaining that idea, and then think about where you'd want to position yourself based on what could happen. And that's a great, I think, exercise to do to really expand your imagination and think long term. Where do I want to be if that were to occur? Is there any other tips real quick before we wrap up and talk about where they can grab the book?
Well, yes. The important thing is something you just said, think long term. What I argue to people is, in your imagination, think long term. So you might be thinking a decade or two or three or even more ahead, but it's not so much that you're trying to figure out what you're going to be doing then. It's really so that you can figure out what would I like to be doing in the next 6 months or the next 12 months. It makes it more likely that I'll be in a good place then. So it's think long term, but act very short term. And that's a very powerful combination if you can do those two things together.
And that's an important point too. You don't want to just live out there in some fantasy of 6 to 12 months. Like visionaries, myself included, I'll think 5, 10 years out. I have all these things that are just like piled on top of each other, but I then have to drill down to what can I get done today? What can I do this week? And you're right, that balance is critical.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, Glenn, we've got 5 free books to the first 5 responders. Where can they go to pick up a copy of your book, Turning the Future into Revenue?
They should actually send an email to info@futurist.com and say they saw the show with James Rick, The Full Potential Show, and ask for a copy of the book, and we'll send it to them.
All right, great, Glenn. So the first 5 that will email info@futurist.com, you're going to get a free copy of Turning the Future into Revenue. This is a hard copy. He's going to send it to your address. Very generous offer. The first 5 responders, info@futurist.com. And Glenn, can we just follow your work there on your website, futurist.com?
Come to the website. It's full of lots of free information and a regularly updated blog, and we'd love to see anybody there.
It is cool. He's got some cool videos that he's done actually a few years back that are now starting to come to fruition now. So it's kind of like he's the Nostradamus predicting the future in a way, but really just predicting patterns, something that if you follow these points, and I'll just run through them with you real quick, Glenn, that is to constantly learn and ask yourself what you want to learn over the next 6 months, and then explore your imagination a bit with that information, with those patterns that you see emerging. What would that look like, and where do you want to position yourself relative to those emerging trends? Any final thoughts, Glenn, before we wrap up?
The final thought is that there's a lot of conversation in this country today that things are going downhill. And of course, we're in this rough economic time. But I've been talking with a science fiction writer friend just this week, as a matter of fact. We've begun writing an article on we need to change our language around. We're not at the end of everything. If you go elsewhere in the world, as I do frequently, you find that people are very optimistic about the future. They see all kinds of possibilities. We need to start thinking that way again, and I'd encourage everybody to look for where the possibilities are rather than the things that are going wrong.
And so futurist-oriented of you, Glenn, because really possibility thinking leads to greater possibilities, whereas focus on the negative just leads to more negative.
Absolutely.
All right, Glen Hiemstra, futurist.com, futurist.com. Turning the future into revenue can be yours if you email as one of the first 5 to info@futurist.com. I encourage everybody to check out the website, futurist.com, and they can get the book if they're not one of the first 5 at your website. Right, Glenn?
Yes, they can.
Okay, great. Glenn, so glad to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much.
It's been great having you. And everybody who's watching and listening right now, be sure and like and subscribe to Full Potential Show so you can get more great insights from people like Glenn and freebies that you'll only find right here on the Full Potential Show. Take care, Glenn. Have a great afternoon.
You too.
See ya. Well, that concludes this week's episode of the Full Potential Show, your #1 non-boring source for personal development. I'm James Rick, and if you want to get more positive programming for your brain absolutely free on a weekly basis, just visit fullpotential.com.
If you like the Full Potential Show, you're going to love the Full Potential Club. What would you like most as a Full Potential Club member? Be 2 to 3 times more productive? Do what you're passionate about? Have more energy? Reduce your work hours? Travel the world? Enjoy an amazing lifestyle on a frugal budget? What if you could do them all? James Rick has been there and done it in ways that few people have. For anyone serious about taking their life or business to the next level, you know you've got to do more than just watch. You've got to do. Join James Rick and other like-minded people for an incredible $10 a month at fullpotential.com/club. Be educated. Be empowered. Be the best version of you. fullpotential.com/club. Try it free for 30 days.